Hi everyone. I wanted to say thanks actually to Deborah for putting this event together, and to Megan for support in doing so, and also for the kind of nimbleness in reorganising it as a result of the UCU strike action. So what I'm going to talk about today is I guess it's kind of a side project. So the research I've been doing in London since 2015 has mainly focused on, I guess you call it, precarious housing, particularly among low-income private sector tenants. I've been tracing their experiences of eviction, their encounters with different advice services, and their encounters with different grassroots activist groups. I haven't focused specifically on council estates, so public housing estates, except in this one instance which I'm going to talk about today, where community organisers in this particular community actually approached Deborah and then me because they were trying to collate a collection of 200 narratives that they'd collected on their estate, talking about the issues that I'm going to reflect on. So what I've been doing since then is kind of going to the estate semi-regularly to work with them, looking at these narratives. And so today's paper is kind of an attempt to do something scholarly with that, but it's still at kind of quite an ethnographic level. So maybe you can help me draw out some of the main themes. So the paper responds to recent calls for more detailed studies of resistance to gentrification and displacement. I just realised I haven't put my PowerPoint up. Okay, there we go. So it responds to recent calls for more detailed studies of resistance to gentrification and displacement, and to the growing interest in processes of so-called commoning in urban settings. So it's based on interviews and participant observation conducted between 2015 and 2017 in West Hendon, a council estate located in northwest London. The paper explores the experiences and recollections of local community organisers who fought a regeneration plan that threatened to push hundreds of residents out of their homes and force others into debt with the scheme's private developer. So although the efforts of these residents to prevent the redevelopment from going ahead ultimately proved unsuccessful, my aim is to explore how they nonetheless achieved something which I think is highly significant. So the creation of new networks of mutual support among homeowners, secure council tenants and temporarily housed families, all of whom were based on the estate and all of whom related to housing in different material terms. So drawing on recent work by Massimo De Angelis and Ida Sussa among others, I argue that these networks constituted a form of embryonic commoning, that is, the social labour that goes into producing decommodified common goods that satisfy socially determined needs, desires and aspirations. So this commoning was anchored by what I term affective leadership. And I use this concept to highlight the centrality of care, emotional labour and friendship to a particular style of leadership that was employed by two women, Yasmin and Laura, whose work enabled the community to overcome mistrust among residents and bring different tenure subgroups together against the redevelopment. So in doing so, I want to suggest that commoning should not merely be understood as a creation of decommodified spaces in political or economic terms, but also as a process bound up with the forging of new relations of care and mutual obligation in everyday life. While such practices cannot by themselves overcome enclosure, I argue that the case of West Hendon provides a valuable glimpse into the kinds of ethical and relational social forms that may prove essential to future struggles around the defence and creation of viable common systems. So there's some important background to this particular story. I'm going to go over it relatively briefly to save on time. But it's worth saying that it's probably difficult to imagine how London was in 1981, when over 870,000 homes in the capital, which was 35% of all properties, were classified as socially rented public housing. This compared with around 1.2 million owner-occupied homes and just 370,000 properties in the private rented sector. So this had been part of the social democratic settlement that followed the Second World War, a huge programme of state house building which had given millions of working class Britons secure and affordable homes in the form of council housing. So then we had in 1980, with the arrival of Margaret Thatcher, was the launch of the so-called Right to Buy scheme, which gave council tenants discounted encouragement to buy their council properties, and therefore take them out of public housing and into the private sector. Key to this policy was the fact that those council houses would not be replaced by more public housing, so it's a steady erosion of public housing. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, this decimated the country's social housing stock as people took up the opportunity to buy their own homes. Between 1999 and 2010 alone, for example, London lost 85,000 council houses to right to buy. So more recently, in the context of austerity in the UK, councils have been inhibited to borrow in order to build new public housing. So that's local authorities at the municipal level, meaning they've increasingly turned to private developers in order to meet house building targets. Under the guise of regenerating older estates, in many instances this has led to the wholesale demolition of existing council housing and its replacement with so-called mixed income developments. These often maximise profits for developers by privileging properties for private sale and luxury rent rather than low-cost rent. So in 2015, for example, of the 170,000 homes built in the UK, just 2,500 were social housing built by councils. Developers have become adept at using so-called viability assessments. That's essentially a legal right they have to make a certain level of profit to reduce the number of affordable units in new projects. The government in 2010 also changed the definition of affordable to 80% of the market rate, which in a city like London, where you have huge speculation in property, 80% of the market rate is nowhere near affordable for the majority of people. Joe Beswick and Joe Penny have just written a really good paper that came out about a month ago, and they've looked at the role of councils and the increasing entanglement between local councils and financial institutions in order to meet house building targets. And they've called this, I think it's entrepreneurial financialized municipalism. So that's well worth a read. This is a poster in my borough in Hackney. Hackney's probably one of the ones that's more critical of central government policy. They're still carrying out these policies because in a sense they feel they're forced to. So this is next to new development where they say 28 new council houses for social renting, 39 for social ownership and 8 for private sale. So they're using private sales to subsidise social housing in these contexts because of the cuts and the restrictions on central funding. So West Hendon is based in Barnet, which is a suburban affluent borough in the northwest of London. I think it's London's fastest growing borough. It's one of a cluster of working class estates that sit close to the Welsh Harp, which is a reservoir and nature reserve. West Hendon also is a short walk from a train station, which gives a connection to central London in about 20 minutes. So this is the estate as it was about 18 months ago. So these are 1960s blocks that are arranged in kind of horseshoe shapes, and you can see just on the far left of the picture there some trees. That's the Welsh Harp, which is the kind of nature reserve. So these council houses are actually like prime real estate because they overlook the nature reserve. And you can see some new blocks going up, which I will come on to. So because the area was prime real estate and because there'd been underinvestment in these public housing units for some time, there'd been talk about regenerating the area for many years. A Labour and Liberal Democrat coalition council had first raised the possibility of redevelopment in 2002, but they lost control of the local authority. They'd raised the possibility of redeveloping in the 90s, but they lost control of the authority in 2002 with the Conservatives taking power. The Tories pledged a new large-scale project that entailed replacing the estate's 780 homes with 2,000 new ones. Now, they made a pledge in 2002 that all of the council's tenants, which was at that time 450 households, would be rehoused on the same site. And thanks to this pledge, local residents approved the redevelopment through a ballot, and later came to regret that approval. Like many estates in the post-Thatcher era, West Hendon had already undergone several significant changes prior to the regeneration swinging into motion. So around 140 council tenants had bought their homes under right to buy at discount prices, becoming leaseholders, meaning they owned their properties but not the land on which it stood. Some of these leaseholders then sold these on to buy-to-let landlords who rented them out to private tenants. And then during the 2000s, the local council started moving in homeless families on non-secure tenancies. So where council tenants have lifetime tenancies and have those legally protected, these new residents were on non-secure tenancies, so technically they could be evicted at 2 months' notice. By 2014, there were around 250 people on the estate who were legally classified as homeless who were in this position. So you kind of have between council tenants, leaseholders, private landlords, private renters, and non-secure homeless tenants. You had kind of 5 different clusters on the estate, 5 different types of tenancy. All of which meant that when the council announced its regeneration plan, it was very difficult to organise people. So Yasmin Parsons, so this is just an artist's impression of some of the new luxury blocks that are going up in place of the old Horseshoe estate. Yasmin Parsons was a long-term resident on the estate who became owner of her property through right to buy. She'd been involved in some of the early plans when she was initially optimistic about the development, and had even participated in the partnership board with the private developer and the council. In 2013, she received news that shocked her and many other leaseholders and council tenants, where Barnet Council announced it would no longer be sticking to the original pledge to rehouse all tenants on the same site, and instead would be only providing to those with secure lifetime council tenancies. The rest of the properties would be sold as private homes. So this meant that none of the 250 non-secure tenants would be given housing on the estate. It also meant that leaseholders, so those people who bought their homes, were going to be bought out as part of the regeneration. But because their properties were deemed to be far less than the value of the new properties, even though most of them had paid off their mortgages, they were going to be forced into shared equity schemes in order for the values of their old properties to factor into the values of the new ones. So they essentially were either, if they wanted to stay, they had to become new debtors, or they would be bought out and could use the money to find property in the same area. But of course, house prices had risen exponentially, and none of them would be able to live in the sort of 2 or 3 bed flats they had. They'd have to go down to 1 bed flat or live somewhere cheaper in London or outside of London. Now, one of the problems that people faced was that leaseholders were contacted by the council as one block, non-secure tenants as another, private tenants as another, and there was never a kind of collective move by residents to tackle these problems together. Now, all of that changed when there was a knock at Yasmin's door in February 2014, and a young woman called Laura arrived with a clipboard, started asking for questions about her views on life on the estate. Now, Laura was a community organiser who'd been involved in an organisation called Locality. Locality was actually part of David Cameron's Big Society agenda. Oh wow, okay. Who had been funding local community organisers to go out and carry kind of empowerment exercises at the local community level. So between them, Yasmin and Laura carried out 300 listenings on the estate and realised that regeneration was by far and away the paramount concern for local residents. So they organised a series of meetings and managed through a course of several months to get leaseholders, council tenants and non-secured tenants to start talking to each other and using these processes of listening to understand each other's problems. So one tenant who I spoke to, called Debbie, said these meetings were so different from all the other political groups I'd ever seen. What was going on was so important. You'd go in and you'd listen and you'd do what people wanted. It wasn't about going in there with your own agenda. It was so different and so refreshing. It was such a good way to work. I'm going to have to skip some of this, but they developed a buddy system whereby anyone who was contacted by the council would have someone else attend with them. Yasmin, who'd become very experienced in working with the council, imparted her knowledge through various training schemes. And over the course of the next 6 months, they developed an organisation called Our West Hendon. They arranged 70,000 signatures in support of their demand, which was for a public inquiry into the legality of the regeneration scheme. They organised protests, so here you can see against what they called the social cleansing of their estate, and greeted Boris Johnson when he came to visit Barnet to open 3 new council houses in a different ward of the borough. Now, I started working with this estate towards the end of this process, but I attended a lot of these training sessions they did with other communities in the area, and also attended things like their Christmas parties. And what really became apparent through the work I'd done with them was that the sense that before there hadn't really been a strong sense of community on the estate, or there'd been a sense that community was being eroded. As Laura put it at West Hendon's Christmas party in 2016, we created a community. People used to just say hello to each other, but now they go on the piss together, so they get drunk together. There's more of an emotional connection, a deep human one, and I think we really hammered home the importance of community. Now, in a sense, this was a moral victory, but ultimately a defeat for the community. The public inquiry ruled that the regeneration was legal, and the first compulsory purchase order went through in early 2016, and the second one is currently going through courts at the moment, and there's going to be a third one. So these buildings will all be knocked down. Large numbers of people have already been evicted. They did secure a concession from the council that Yasmin estimates covered 45% of non-secure tenants, that they would at least be rehoused in Barnet, so not in the same area specifically, but in the same borough. So to offer some sort of brief concluding thoughts. On the face of it, the West Hendon case appears to be an all too familiar story of what David Harmony famously termed accumulation by dispossession. Over the course of the regeneration project, hundreds of low-income residents, among them leaseholders, council tenants, non-secure tenants and private renters, had been forced to leave the estate. Some had left of their own volition due to the anxieties generated by the redevelopment, while others had simply been evicted when the CPO had been granted. But I want to argue that this was not merely a case of another London estate being socially cleansed without any glimmer of hope. Amid the defeat that our West Hendon had suffered, they had also stumbled across an embryonic model of community organising that was grounded first and foremost in the value of listening and in the formation of new effective bonds and new relations of mutuality between different tenants. I want to suggest that this is perhaps the first stage of what we might call commoning, which is the social labour and social relations that form the basis, or could form the basis, for a common system. So in this sense, although West Hendon's residents lost the opportunity to develop this proto-commons further, their campaign of resistance perhaps offers a fleeting glimpse of what regeneration might look like under different material conditions and different political conditions. And I think one key point I want to emphasise is that central to this was a particular form of affective leadership that Yasmin and Laura undertook. I think that this kind of leadership will be integral to future projects around regeneration and around commoning.